your God, and your descendants forever. Those three factors were part of the promise and the covenant that God made with Abraham. It is on that covenant we as believers stand today. That covenant cannot be broken. Abram was put to sleep when God walked through the pieces of the animals that were cut in half and sealed the covenant with Abram. And that covenant could not be broken because it was made by God alone. The next part of the Bible story we want to look at is we want to look at Isaac and his relationship to his sons. Isaac was given the wife Rebekah, and from that marriage came a set of twins, Esau and Jacob. Esau was the firstborn and Jacob the second. So that in ancient times the firstborn was always given the double portion of inheritance and the authority of the family clan. Esau, being a man of the woods and a hunter, came in one day into the tent, and Jacob was making a stew, and Esau was famished. Esau said, "Give me some of that stew." Jacob, being a very, very smart young man, said, "No, I won't give you any of this unless you sell me your birthright." Esau could have cared less about his birthright. It showed when he married his Hittite wives. He did not have any regard for his birthright, that precious promise that was given to Abraham and to Isaac. Esau just gave away. He was not interested in his birthright promise, so that when his brother Jacob said, "Give me the birthright and I'll give you some lentil stew," Esau said, "Yes, my flesh is hungry. I'm famished. I'll give you my birthright." And folks, today, our birthright, our inheritance is back in the loins of Abraham as his descendants. Our inheritance to the promise is because we are the descendants of Abraham. That is our birthright. And yet today we are giving that birthright away. We're saying our flesh cries out for traditions and doctrines of men. So I want you to take notice here that when Esau gave away his birthright, it said, "And Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated." God hated Esau because of his lack of respect and irreverence toward God and the promise that God had given. When Isaac became ill and on his deathbed, Rebekah and Jacob came up with a plan. Isaac had sent Esau out into the woods to hunt to bring back meat for his last meal, because he loved the wild meat that Esau would hunt for. But Rebekah told Jacob, "I'll make up a meal. You pretend to be Esau and serve your father the meal. He will give you his blessing, the blessing that was given from Abraham to Isaac, and from Isaac it will now come to you." Jacob, of course, was concerned that his father would find out that he was being deceived, but his mother assured him. So Jacob entered into his father's tent, went to his bed, and Isaac questioning him, saying, "Are you sure that you're my son Esau?" And Jacob said and assured him, "Yes, I am, father." And with that, Isaac then gave Jacob the blessing and the promises that God gave to him. And he told his son that he would have all the land that God had given Abraham, and that he would have all of the descendants that God had said Abraham would have, and that God would be his God and his descendants' God. When Esau returned from the hunt and found out that Jacob had received his father's blessing, Esau was in great torment. From that point on, Esau and Jacob has been in conflict. Today we know the descendants of Esau as the Edomites, or as the Palestinians, who have now surrounded the nation of Israel. The Edomites, you can read about in the book of Obadiah. You can see what their fate is. It's an interesting fate. It's part of prophecy. It's something that we will see in our future. So that from Jacob receiving his father's blessing and having the birthright, he heads out to find a wife. Jacob journeys back to Padan Aram, which was the land of his mother's family, and he goes to his uncle Laban and requests a wife of one of his daughters, Rachel. Laban agrees, but says that Jacob has to work for him for 7 years. So Jacob does this and marries one of the daughters, but finds out after the wedding night that it was the older sister Leah that he had married. With that, because of his love for Rachel, he agrees once again with his uncle that he will work another 7 years for Rachel. So Jacob ends up with 2 wives. Along with these 2 wives, the wives' handmaidens are taken into Jacob's tent. And from these 4 women, Jacob produces 12 sons and 1 daughter, Dinah. These 12 sons will later become the 12 tribes of Israel. As Jacob is working and as the years are going by, God speaks 3 times to Jacob. 3 times to Jacob. He speaks and repeats the promise that was given to Abraham. However, in Genesis 35, he changes this promise to Jacob, and he says, Jacob, your descendants will become a nation and a company of nations. Now, this is very important. God tells Jacob, your descendants will become a nation and a company of nations. Now, today, and in modern Christianity, we have only focused in on one nation of Jacob's descendants, and that's Israel. And yet here, God speaks about a company of nations. We want to tie that back in with God in Genesis 12 saying that Abraham's seed would be mixed throughout all the peoples. So there's a line here. A line that we must follow through and investigate. Jacob proceeds to have 12 sons, and one of which, from his wife Rachel, who he dearly loves, Joseph, brings on the jealousy of his brothers. And we all know the Bible story of how the jealous brothers took Joseph with his coat of many colors, which I love because it's so symbolic of red and yellow, black and white, the Father's plan for all humanity to be redeemed. Red and yellow, black and white, the cloak that was given to Joseph by his father. And the brothers take Joseph in this cloak, and they take him and they put him in a pit. And they bring back the cloak to his father Jacob with blood all over it, saying that Joseph had been killed, which was not true because Joseph was sold to a caravan that went to Egypt and was sold in Egypt as a slave. Through many circumstances, God ordained Joseph was brought up through the ranks in Egypt to become second to the Pharaoh. And as second to the Pharaoh, he was the administrator of all the land of Egypt. And God had shown Joseph that there was a famine that was coming. And Joseph set up a plan where Egypt would store up enough food and grain for 7 years that would last Egypt for its 7-year famine. Well, when the drought hit, and all the lands around had no food, Jacob and his 11 sons were without food, but they had money. And Jacob sent his sons into Egypt to buy food. Through a series of many circumstances, Joseph reveals himself to his brothers who are in Egypt to buy food, and shows mercy upon them, and grants them provisions. With that, the brothers bring Jacob and all of the family into Egypt. Jacob and his family set up their tents and their camp, and they multiply. and they thrive in this new land, and they stay there even after the drought is over. It is at this time that Jacob takes to his sickbed and his deathbed, and he calls Joseph to him, and he says, "Joseph, bring me your sons." For Joseph had had 2 sons by his Egyptian wife. And Jacob said, "Bring me your sons." Jacob now was named Israel. His name had been changed when God met with him, and it said he wrestled with him all night, and at the end of the night, when Jacob said, "I will not let you go until you bless me," it says that God changed his name to Israel. So Israel, which is Hebrew for prevailing with God, Israel was laying on his deathbed, and Joseph brought in his 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. Joseph presented the boys, and Israel says to Joseph, "These 2 lads are mine. From this day forward, I am putting my name Israel on these 2 boys. They will be known as Israel. Any children you have after these boys, Joseph, will be yours. But these boys I am elevating up to the status of my sons." I believe the reason why Israel went this extra step with these 2 boys is because he knew, inspired by the Holy Spirit, that down the line of time in mankind's history, the descendants of these boys would be questioned, because these boys were half Gentiles and half Hebrew. And he wanted to make sure that the descendants of Ephraim and Manasseh would have the name Israel on them. In fact, when he blessed Ephraim and Manasseh, he said, "May your descendants grow into a multitude in the midst of the earth." Well, the ancient rabbi Rashi says that a multitude in the midst of the earth is an idiom, a Hebrew idiom, for a swarm of fish. Just like a swarm of fish. So that when Israel was saying to Ephraim and Manasseh, "Your descendants will become like a swarm of fish," do light bulbs come off in your mind? Do you start thinking, "Oh my goodness, what do we think of when we think of fish?" We think of all of the times that Jesus referred to, "I will make you fishers of men." And the time in Luke 5 when he said to Peter, "Peter, put down your net." And when Peter brought the net up, they were filled with fish. These little pictures are something that we are to take heed to, especially when it's followed by God inspiring Israel to look at Ephraim, the youngest son, and to give a blessing to Ephraim, saying, "Your descendants, Ephraim, will become like the multitude of nations." And that multitude of nations in the Hebrew is the Melogoyim. And Melogoyim can also be translated as the fullness of the Gentiles. So as Israel is looking at Ephraim, and he tells him, "Your descendants will become a multitude of nations, the fullness of the Gentiles." Where else do we see the fullness of the Gentiles? We see it in Peter, when Peter refers to the fullness of the Gentiles. And Jerusalem will be trampled down until the fullness of the Gentiles come in. So right here at this deathbed scene with Israel, there's great things happening that the Father wants us to look at. He wants us to look at these 2 half-breed boys that were Joseph's. And he wants to see that the wording that was used to bless them by Israel draws a great picture of their future. When Manasseh and Ephraim are told that their descendants would become like a swarming multitude of fish in the midst of the earth. And 2,000 years later, Christianity comes along, and our symbol is the fish. Then we have to see that there is a correlation